The room smelled of boiled linen, lamp oil, and the chamomile my mother had left steeping too long on the stove. It was nearly 11 at night, 6 weeks after our daughter was born, and every board in the floor felt cold beneath my bare feet. My husband was sitting on the edge of the bed with his back toward me. I stood by the cradle, one hand resting on its wooden rail, and told him no. I said it quietly. I did not raise my voice. But in our little upstairs room, that one word seemed louder than the baby crying. What happened in the next few minutes was never spoken about again for almost 3 years, and the silence did more damage than the word ever could. My name is Katie. I am an adult Amish woman, a wife, and a mother, and I share these stories because plain life is not the same thing as simple life. There are things we carry behind ordinary doors that outsiders may never see. If you have ever needed time to heal while everyone around you seemed ready for life to return to normal, tell me in the comments what helped you find your voice. Our daughter Ruth was born near the end of February, when the snow along the fence line had turned gray and hard. I was 22 years old. The day she came, the temperature never rose above freezing, and the wind pressed against the north side of the house hard enough to make the lamp flame bend. By evening, wet towels hung beside the cook stove, a basin sat under the table, and my whole world had narrowed to the weight of a 7-pound child against my chest. I had expected pain. Every woman knows birth asks something of the body. What I had not expected was how strange I would feel afterward, as though the person I had been before had stepped out of the room and forgotten to return. My hands were still mine. My face in the washstand mirror was still mine. But I felt borrowed from myself. For the first week, Eli moved softly through the house. He brought water without being asked. He split kindling before breakfast, so I would not need to bend near the woodbox. At 2 a.m, when Ruth would not settle, he walked the hallway with her tucked into the crook of his arm. I remember watching him pass the open bedroom door, his suspenders hanging loose at his sides, whispering the same hymn line again and again because it was the only one he could remember half asleep. I loved him in those hours with a kind of tenderness that almost hurt. That is important for me to say. This is not a story about a cruel stranger. It is about 2 young people who loved each other and still managed to wound each other because neither one knew how to speak plainly when it mattered. By the 3rd week, the meals from neighboring women stopped arriving. The kitchen filled again with the usual work. Bread needed mixing, diapers needed washing, ash needed carried from the stove. The calendar had not become gentler because I had become a mother. I learned to knead dough with Ruth tied against me, and to recognize, from the first small sound in the cradle, whether she was hungry, wet, cold, or simply lonely. Some mornings I felt strong. Other mornings, lifting a full kettle made my body ache in places I did not know how to name aloud. We did not speak openly about the details of recovery. Women offered practical advice in short sentences while folding laundry or slicing apples. Rest when the baby rests. Drink more water. Do not lift the wash basket yet. The advice was useful, but there was a boundary around the subject. You could say you were tired. You could say you were sore. You could not easily say that your own body frightened you, or that being touched could make you tense before you had time to understand why. Eli saw me standing at the stove and assumed I was nearly myself again. I do not blame him for failing to read a language I had never taught him. I looked capable. My apron was tied. Supper appeared at 6. I smiled when company came. From the outside, the house had resumed its shape. Inside me, nothing had settled. At 5 weeks, he began reaching for my hand after the lamp was turned down. It was not forceful. Sometimes he rested his palm against my shoulder while we lay beneath the quilt. I knew what he was asking without words, and each time I pretended Ruth had stirred, I would sit up, listen into the darkness, and say I ought to check her. Sometimes she was fully asleep. I would stand beside the cradle anyway, counting her breaths until Eli turned over. I told myself I was sparing his feelings. In truth, I was hiding because I did not believe a good wife should need to explain why she was afraid. No one had said that exact sentence to me. That is how some expectations work. They are not always spoken. They live in what people avoid saying, in the stories that are told only one way, and in the praise given to women who never seem to need anything. I had grown up admiring endurance. My mother could work through a fever, keep 6 children clean, and prepare a meal for 20 without complaining. I mistook her strength for the absence of limits. I thought love meant never making another person's life harder. So every night I delayed the conversation, and every morning the dread grew. The 6th week brought a thaw. Water dripped from the eaves all afternoon and froze again after sunset. That evening, Ruth cried from 7 until nearly 10. I walked her from the kitchen window to the pantry door, 12 steps each way until my arms trembled. Eli had spent the day repairing a wagon wheel in a neighbor's shop. He came home smelling of cold iron and pine shavings, ate reheated stew, and tried to soothe the baby. Nothing worked. When she finally slept, I lowered her into the cradle so carefully that my back cramped. The room became perfectly still. I remember thinking that silence should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like a door closing. Eli sat on the bed. He looked tired, too. There were half-moons of dirt beneath his fingernails, and a fresh split crossed one knuckle. He held out his hand to me. I did not take it. He asked if something was wrong. I said I was tired. He said we were both tired. He waited, and when I did not move, he asked whether I was still his wife. Even now, I can hear how young we both sounded. He was not asking only for closeness. He was asking whether the child had replaced him, whether our marriage had disappeared into feeding times and wet cloths and whispered prayers. But I could not hear the fear beneath his question then. I heard an accusation. I heard that all the work my body had done, and was still doing, had already become inconvenient. I put my hand on the cradle rail because the floor seemed unsteady. Then I said, "No, not tonight." He looked at me and asked when. I said I did not know. That was the answer he could not bear. His face changed, not into rage, but into something shut and hard. He stood, pulled on his trousers, and went downstairs. A moment later, the back door closed. He did not slam it. The restraint of that quiet click made it worse. I watched through the window as he crossed the yard toward the barn with a lantern. The snow had become a dark crust under his boots. He stayed there for almost an hour. I sat on the edge of the bed and cried without making a sound because I did not want to wake Ruth. When he returned, he placed the lantern on its hook, lay down facing the wall, and said nothing. I said nothing, too. By morning, we had begun the arrangement that would hold us for years. We behaved as though the night had not happened. He milked before breakfast. I fried potatoes. He asked whether we needed flour from the store. I said yes, 25 pounds if the price was fair. We spoke about weather, fence posts, and the neighbor's lame horse. We did not speak about the question he had asked, or the fear that had made me refuse him. Silence can look peaceful from the road. The chimney smokes. The washing moves on the line. A husband and wife sit side by side in meeting. No one sees the distance measured in inches beneath a shared quilt. During the following months, my body recovered faster than my trust did. That difference confused me. I could carry a basket again. I could weed 2 garden rows before resting. I could walk the mile to my parents' house with Ruth bundled against my chest. Because I was physically stronger, I believed I had lost the right to be hesitant. Eventually, I stopped saying no. But agreeing is not the same as feeling safe enough to say yes. I went quiet inside myself. Eli noticed the quiet, though he did not know its name. He became careful in a way that felt more like distance than tenderness. He stopped reaching for my hand when we sat together. If I flinched, he withdrew completely. Neither of us wanted to cause another wound, so we kept farther apart and called that peace. There were good days. I want to be honest about that too. We laughed when Ruth discovered mud and tried to eat it. We worked well together during harvest. On our 3rd anniversary, Eli carved a new handle for my bread knife because the old one had split. He shaped it from cherry wood and sanded it smooth enough that it felt warm in my palm. Love did not disappear. It became buried under caution. The moment when the silence finally cracked did not happen during an argument. It happened in my mother's washroom on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Ruth was nearly 3. I had come to help with laundry because my youngest brother had been ill. Steam clouded the windows, and the wringer squeaked every time we turned it. My mother watched me fold one of Eli's shirts. I pressed the same sleeve flat 3 times. She asked whether we had quarreled. I said no. That answer was true in the narrowest sense. We almost never quarreled. She kept feeding wet fabric through the rollers. Then she said one sentence. Silence is not the same as peace. She did not ask another question. She did not offer a speech about marriage. She simply laid the next shirt in the basin and gave me room to decide whether I would speak. I did not tell her everything. I said that after Ruth was born, I had been afraid to disappoint Eli, and then I had disappointed him anyway. I said we had never found our way back to the conversation. My mother nodded. Her face did not change with shock or judgment. That steadiness loosened something in me. For years I had feared that naming the problem would make it enormous. Instead, saying it in that small room made it a size I could finally hold. I walked home after the rain stopped. The road was soft, and my shoes collected mud at each step. Ruth jumped over every puddle and missed nearly all of them. By the time we reached our lane, the hem of her dress was brown. Eli was in the workshop fitting a hinge to a cupboard door. I stood in the doorway longer than necessary, listening to the rasp of his file. My heart beat harder than it had the night Ruth was born. I told him I needed to speak about the night he went to the barn. He did not pretend to forget. He set the file down at once. That surprised me. We sat on 2 low stools beside the workbench. The room smelled of sawdust and linseed oil. Through the open door, Ruth was stacking scraps of wood in the yard. I told him that when I refused him, I was not refusing our marriage. I was frightened, exhausted, and still healing. I told him I had needed him to ask what was happening inside me, not when I would be useful to him again. My voice shook. I nearly softened the words, but I did not. Eli stared at his hands for a long time. Then he said he had gone to the barn because he was ashamed of how angry and unwanted he felt. He had believed leaving the room was the kindest thing he could do. When he came back, he thought my silence meant I wanted the matter buried. I told him my silence meant I was scared. He said his silence meant the same. That was the first time I understood how 2 people can build the same wall from opposite sides. We did not solve 3 years in one afternoon. There was no grand apology that erased everything. Eli told me he was sorry for making my recovery about his fear. I told him I was sorry I had hidden behind excuses instead of trusting him with the truth sooner. But I also told him something I had only just learned. My fear did not make his question my fault. Both things could be true. I could wish I had spoken sooner, and he could still take responsibility for the pressure I felt. That distinction mattered. Without it, forgiveness would have become another way for me to disappear. We began with small changes. We spoke before the lamp went out, when neither of us was trapped by darkness or fatigue. I practiced saying what I needed while the need was still small. An hour alone, help with the wash, a hand held without any further expectation. Eli practiced hearing those needs without treating them as a judgment on him. Sometimes he failed. Sometimes I waited too long and became sharp. But failure was no longer followed by months of pretending. The conversation could be clumsy, and still be kinder than silence. A year later, when our second child was born, the house looked much the same as it had after Ruth. Linen dried by the stove. A kettle steamed, snow pressed against the lower windows. But we were different. Before the birth, Eli and I spoke plainly about recovery. We agreed there would be no calendar deciding when I should be ready. Readiness would not be assumed from the bread being baked or the floor being swept. He would ask, and I could answer honestly. Afterward, he protected my rest with a seriousness that almost made me laugh. He sent visitors home when I became tired. He learned exactly how much soap to shave into the diaper water. At night, he asked whether I wanted closeness, conversation, or sleep. Sometimes the answer was sleep. He did not turn toward the wall. I do not tell this story because every Amish marriage is like mine. It is not. Communities differ, families differ, and private lives cannot be reduced to one rule. I also do not tell it to place our way of life on trial. Silence around childbirth, marriage, and a woman's limits exists far beyond plain communities. You can find it in houses with electricity and houses lit by oil lamps. You can find it wherever appearances are valued more than honest words. I tell it because for a long time I believed that being a faithful wife meant making my needs invisible. I know now that hiding the truth from the person beside you does not protect a marriage. It leaves both people guessing, and fear is a poor interpreter. Refusing my husband that night did not break our marriage. What nearly broke it was our decision to let shame speak for us afterward. The word no was not the enemy. It was information. It meant I was not ready. It meant I needed care that neither of us yet knew how to give. When we finally treated that word as the beginning of a conversation instead of the end of affection, tenderness returned slowly and honestly. If there is one thing I understand now, it is that peace is not created by the absence of disagreement. Peace is created when the truth is safe enough to enter the room. That applies to marriage, family, faith, and almost every close bond I know. You can love someone deeply and still need time. You can forgive someone and still name what hurt. You can be strong and still ask to be handled gently. Those truths do not weaken devotion. They give it somewhere real to stand. If you would like to hear more honest stories about marriage, motherhood, faith, and the ordinary work of Amish life, you are welcome to subscribe. And I would like to ask you something specific. Have you ever mistaken silence for peace? And what finally helped you speak? I read more of your answers than you may realize. Sometimes the bravest thing said in a quiet house is only one word, spoken clearly, before the silence has time to grow around it.